Hi, in this video I'm going to introduce the concepts of prescriptivism and descriptivism in linguistics. Although these concepts might not appear particularly complex, they are often misunderstood and misrepresented. They can also invite strong feelings and opinions. On one side is the sense language decline and social decline go hand in hand.
No, you moron! I could care less means you could care more!
Many feel that perceived misuses of language, when taken in aggregate, are indicative of a more general cultural decay.
We must rid our speech of slang.
Preservation of linguistic conventions, then, is understood as an effort to maintain our manners and morals.
Other than me also believe the same, that we are destroying the English language as we know it because of the mobile phone, from SMS text.
On the other side is the observation that many prescriptive rules are not based on facts of usage.
If you don't like nouns becoming verbs, then for heaven's sake avoid Shakespeare, who made a doing word out of a thing word every chance he got.
And that the conventions that are purported to be upheld are often enforced haphazardly, with little understanding of linguistic structure. Moreover, some have argued that claims of misuse or error are often directed at speakers of language varieties perceived to be outside the mainstream.
The sound comes at the end. The S sound comes in the middle. But what do people say? X, yes.
Thus, prescriptivism can be used to preserve particular kinds of social hierarchies. We're going to wade into the debate here so you might have a clear view of the two orientations. And even more specifically, I want you to recognize the purpose as well as the limitations of the descriptive approach that will inform your linguistic investigations. I also will demonstrate how COCA and other BYU corpora can help us investigate questions of rules and usage. Alright, let's start with some very basic definitions. Prescriptivism dictates how language should be used. Descriptivism analyzes the patterns and structures of language as it is used. While these definitions are useful, they can sometimes be confusing. Let's look at an example. In this corrected essay, the instructor has marked an error where the student has written "to visited." On the one hand, this might appear prescriptive because the instructor is correcting the student, indicating how the language should be used. On the other hand, the infinitive in English is not formed by to plus the past participle as the student has done. This is a descriptive fact about English structure. So which is it, prescriptive or descriptive? We'll revisit this example at the end of the video after we talk a little more about prescriptivism and descriptivism. Another way to think about the difference between the two is to think about their orientation to language. Prescriptivism tends to approach language as a set of conventions and as having an ideal correct form. Descriptivism approaches language as data to be investigated and analyzed. One important difference to understand between these approaches is the ways in which they use the words rule and grammar. In prescriptivism, rule is used as it is in etiquette.
Cut small, bite-sized pieces of eat separately. Try not to talk or take a drink of anything while you have food in your mouth. Eat as quietly as possible.
It is used to suggest a convention or manners. In descriptivism, rule is used more like it is in chemistry or physics. Consider projectile motion. The rules governing projectile motion enable us to describe the trajectory of an object, in this case a Buick fired from a cannon. Or we might think of the rules governing planetary motion. Kepler's laws not only allow us to describe the orbits of the planets, they have facilitated the development of modern communications technologies. So in a prescriptive orientation, rules are more analogous to etiquette. A descriptive orientation frames rules as governing principles that help to explain patterns in our data. The other term that these two approaches use differently is grammar. One way that we can broadly show the difference in the uses of the term is through COCA. I'm going to search for adjectives that precede the word grammar in different text types. This should give us a general idea of patterns in the use of the term grammar in different domains. To do this, I'll type the part of speech tag for adjective, followed by a space, and then grammar. I'll start with the spoken text type. There we find that bad is the adjective that most frequently occurs before grammar. We also find other collocates that imply a particular kind of judgment: proper, poor, loose, and good. Now let's repeat the search in the newspaper text type. Here the most frequent collocate is the neutral English. We also find the neutral modifier conventional, but as in the spoken text type, we also find the adjectives bad, poor, correct, and good. If we do this search for a third time in the academic text type, we get a somewhat different pattern. Here the three most frequent collocates are the neutral terms English and explicit, as well as the technical term generative, which comes from Chomsky and linguistics. Although the modifiers bad and good don't appear at the top of the list, we do have correct and proper. Now if we were to really analyze these patterns, it would not be enough to merely look at the collocations. We would need to examine the concordance lines to better understand how these phrases are used in context. For example, the phrase correct grammar may appear in a way that is a critique of that notion. However, the concordance data for that phrase seems to adhere primarily to a prescriptive orientation to grammar. Another way to show the difference in the use of grammar as a term is to look at an example in context. Here is an example of a prescriptive use of the term. The author is quoting the American Revolutionary War sailor John Paul Jones. In introducing the quotation, the author notes its ungrammatical use of the split infinitive in the phrase, "to always be prepared." The convention the author is referencing is described in this example from a 20th century style guide. The guide advises against putting a word or phrase between the infinitive particle to and the verb, and it claims the example with soon between to and see is incorrect, but is correctly placed at the end of the clause. This convention has a rather long history. Although it circulates earlier in the 19th century, it was popularized by Henry Alford in his book, A Plea for the Queen's English. And here is the relevant passage. What is particularly interesting to us is his claim about a construction like to scientifically illustrate as being a practice entirely unknown to English speakers and writers. This should strike any English speaker as an odd claim.
To boldly go where no man has gone before.
And it is one that we can investigate using COCA. For this, we'll search in the most formal text type, academic. From the part of speech list, find the tag for the infinitive verb form. Then we'll type to, followed by the adverb tag. We find that this is a relatively common practice, even in academic writing. The most frequent realization of the construction is to better understand, with 584 occurrences, but we also have many other examples. Changing the display to chart, we can search for distributions across text types. We find that the frequency of the construction in academic writing is surprisingly second only to spoken. Many prescriptive rules were popularized during the 18th century. You might have heard of the rule that you shouldn't end a sentence with a preposition. The first example of this rule comes from the author John Dryden in 1672, but it is popularized by Robert Lowth in his Introduction to English Grammar, which was first published in 1762. Here is the relevant passage in Lowth's grammar. Note that he describes the sentence final preposition as an idiom that is appropriate to the familiar style in writing, but that moving the preposition before the relative pronoun which produces a more elevated style. So he sees the construction as a question of style, not grammaticality. Another prescriptive rule that dates from the same period is the avoidance of multiple negation. This is Lindley Murray, another influential 18th century grammarian, and here is his advice on double negatives. He argues that in English, two negatives destroy each other and are equivalent to an affirmative. In the examples he provides, this is actually true. However, no speaker of English would interpret Bill Withers singing
"Ain't no sunshine when she's gone"
as saying it's sunny, or Pink Floyd singing
"We don't need no education"
as saying we could really use a good education, or when Mick Jagger sings that he means he's quite satisfied. This is because the syntax of multiple negation can signal an affirmative, as Alfred suggests in the example not ungrammatical, but can also be used for emphasis, as it is in the preceding musical examples. From a descriptive orientation, we would want to investigate and understand the structures that govern those different forms, and we might also be interested in how the construction varies by community and context. Here is an example that I want to explore using a couple of the BYU corpora. In this clip, Jennifer Garner corrects Conan O'Brien for his use of snuck.
There's time when you snuck into the room to see what the...
I sneaked into the room. Snuck isn't a word, Conan, and you went to Harvard and you should know that.
Snuck, past and past part of sneak.
In the segment, as proof that snuck is a word, O'Brien does what most of us do. He turned to the dictionary. Dictionaries are incredibly useful sources of information. However, like any source, they have their limitations. Inclusion in a dictionary is based on editorial decisions, and sometimes the presence or absence of a word has little relationship to its circulation among speakers and writers. So let's investigate Jennifer Garner's claim. First, we'll compare some simple collocational patterns. First, we need to change the display to compare. Type in sneaked and snuck, and I'll use the wildcard to indicate that we're looking for any word or punctuation mark, and set the range as 1 to the left, meaning we're only looking for tokens that occur immediately to the left of either sneaked or snuck. The first information that stands out is the ratio of their frequencies. Sneaked is used 1.03 times more often than snuck, meaning that their frequencies are almost equal in the corpus. And if we look at collocational patterns, there doesn't appear to be too much difference, though had occurs more with sneaked than has with snuck, so there might be some variation in the preference of one form in the past perfect aspect and the other in the present perfect. We can also change the display to chart and search for the distributions of each form. Here is the distribution for sneaked, and here is the distribution for snuck. The distributions look very similar, though there appears to be a slight preference for snuck in the spoken text type. Now we're moving to COCA, or the corpus of historical American English. With this corpus, we can see changes that have occurred since 1810. The first appearance of snuck isn't until 1880, and it shows an increase in use in the latter part of the 20th century. Let's change our search to sneaked. Sneaked first appears in 1830, and its use increased in the early 20th century. So sneaked appears to be an earlier form in American English, but the competing form snuck is now just as frequent. The relative newness of snuck might be the source of Garner's prescriptive sense that it should be avoided, though that belief is clearly not borne out in the data. Another thing to note about this exchange is Garner's assertion that O'Brien should know the prescriptive convention because he went to Harvard. It is often the case that from a prescriptive orientation, knowledge of conventions is used as a proxy for education or intelligence, and that knowledge is housed in a person, a book, or some other authoritative source. We can see that here in a clip from the old TV show I Love Lucy.
I said, this is indeed distressing news. To what do you attribute your plethora of fatigue?
I heard you the first time, but what language is it?
It's a language I want our child to learn, good English.
That's English?
Yes. Funny thing, when it's spoken correctly, you don't even recognize it, do you? You know, I had no idea how sloppy my speech was until I started reading this book.
Also notice that prescriptivism isn't restricted to grammatical constructions like split infinitives. In this comic representation of her linguistic anxieties, In addition to altering her grammar, Lucy tries to change her pronunciation and her lexicon. This clip is also a good place to call attention to one of the common misunderstandings about prescriptivism. In the Lucy episode, like other examples we've seen, prescriptivism works from the top down. That is, the variety that is idealized or the prestige form is perceived as proper. In the Lucy clip, for example, she replaces words common in less formal registers with highly formal ones. In an earlier example, we talked about sentence final prepositions. Those are also more common in less formal registers, but some prescriptive orientations mark that less formal construction as incorrect. While this kind of top-down orientation is the most common and the most visible form of prescriptivism, it can also operate from the bottom up.
You can't hear your voice. You are really
You know
posh.
you can't hear your accent.
You can't hear it. You're
That's
really
how
posh.
you sound.
That's how you sound to us.
Jeffrey?
Rather than for grammar that is not correct or not proper, here a speaker is confronted because her speech is perceived as too posh.
Are you
Shut up. Jeffrey. I just keep hearing Jeffrey.
Say this is a nice cup of tea.
This is a nice cup of tea.
This is a nice cup of tea.
Although the criticism is not overt, there is an implied suggestion that the woman's accent is a problem because it makes her sound snobby or self-important. Here the author David Foster Wallace prescriptively criticizes the use of prior to, and suggests that before is somehow a more authentic or economical choice.
Seems to me to be an overly charitable way to characterize them. They are, to me, they're like puff words. They're like using utilize instead of use.
And like the previous reality TV clip critiques accent, he views a particular lexical choice as overly ornate or posh.
Why say prior to rather than before? Everybody knows what before means. It's fewer words.
If prescriptivism can be misunderstood as always operating from the top down, descriptivism can be misunderstood as being uncritical.
The descriptive linguists are a curse upon their race, who, of course, think that what the people say is the law. And by that they mean the majority, they mean the uneducated.
In this clip from the documentary American Tongues, John Simon, a former theater critic for New York Magazine, suggests that descriptive linguists view all language as the same, without any notion of correctness. You can see the same sentiment expressed in this posted response to a Steven Pinker article. The writer argues that descriptivism legitimizes incorrectness, which encourages relativism, vulgar populism, and the dumbing down of literate culture. This argument gets back to our earlier discussion about how the word grammar is used differently in prescriptivism and descriptivism. The idea that an utterance is grammatical in descriptivism suggests that it conforms to the systematic rules of whatever language variety that utterance is spoken or written in. In this way, from a descriptive orientation, all language varieties are functionally equal, meaning that whether it is Pittsburghese...
I said, you know what, I have to red up the house. And he looked at me like I was crazy.
Jamaican English...
Society, because you have to really think about kids, because kids are important. And
Hawaiian Creole English...
One language, yeah, that's my language. That's the language of my heart. Maybe I don't use them every day because I don't...
Malaysian English...
Obviously, and then he looked at me, he said, Auntie, what do you want? I looked at him like, what? You call me Auntie? How old am I? You know, and how are you? Hello?
Or estuary English.
I was reading a story to one of the boys the other day and they was like, Daddy, you're so English.
Every variety is grammatically, morphologically, and phonologically structured. Without any underlying structure, people wouldn't be able to form utterances, and they wouldn't be able to understand them. Communication would be impossible. Also, the structures of no one variety are any more logical or consistent than another. This doesn't mean, however, as John Simon or the poster suggests, that a descriptive orientation sees all varieties as being the same. Some descriptive linguists, for example, devote their research to examining the various kinds of social, political, and economic prestige attached to different varieties. Neither does a descriptive orientation suggest that all styles of language are equally appropriate for all situations and audiences. As we have seen from using COCA, A descriptive approach can tell us a lot about how certain linguistic variants can cluster in particular registers and genres. Thus, from a descriptive orientation, things like style guides for particular genres are not necessarily problematic, though we might be interested in investigating whether their stylistic advice actually matches the patterns of use in those genres. Finally, a descriptive orientation does not suggest that all communication is equally effective or that people don't make mistakes. Writing in particular is hard, and a descriptive orientation does not preclude correction.
Romanes eunt domus. People call Romanes, they go the house.
It says Romans go home.
No, it doesn't. What's Latin for Roman? Come on.
Romanus?
Goes like.
Anus?
Vocative plural of anus is?
Annie?
Romani.
Though Monty Python is making fun of pedantry, this clip is not an example of prescriptivism. What the graffiti artist had originally written was in fact ungrammatical in a descriptive sense. It did not conform to the basic structure of Latin grammar. So the centurion's act of correction is really neither prescriptive nor descriptive. It's just a correction of error. Which brings us back to our original example of corrected student writing. So now that you know a little more, is the teacher's correction prescriptive or descriptive? Like the Monty Python example, it's really neither. In this case, you have a student who is not a native speaker of English making a simple error, which the teacher uncontroversially corrects. So the descriptive orientation is not an endorsement of anything goes. Okay, let's review. What are the main differences between prescriptivism and descriptivism is their understanding of the terms rule and grammar. A prescriptive orientation frames rules as an idealized set of linguistic customs or manners. A descriptive orientation frames rules as governing principles that help to explain patterns in our data. According to a prescriptive orientation, an utterance is grammatical if it adheres to its established conventions. From a descriptive orientation, an utterance is grammatical if it follows the systematic structure of the language variety in which it is realized. Thus, a prescriptive orientation tends to idealize language, while a descriptive orientation treats language as data. One of the problems with the prescriptive orientation is that sometimes linguistic judgments become stand-ins for judgments about people's education or intelligence.
Snuck isn't a word, Conan, and you went to Harvard and you should know that.
However, this is not to suggest that prescriptive rules are to be ignored. While some prescriptive rules don't hold up to much scrutiny,
To boldly go where no man has gone before.
Others may be indicative of particular registers. Sentence final prepositions, for example, have a higher frequency in less formal spoken registers than formal written ones. One of the great things about learning more about language and the way it works is that you can make increasingly informed communicative choices based on the situation and the audience. You may know that splitting an infinitive is fine, but have an editor or teacher who dislikes them, so you might choose to avoid them. Or you might be writing an academic essay and find that rewriting a sentence to avoid making it end with a preposition takes too much weird manipulation, so you go with it. Thus, while a research will be undertaken from a descriptive orientation, one of the byproducts of our investigations may be an increased facility with prescriptive rules. Okay, thanks for watching.